Case-Shiller produces. Philadelphia is the largest urban market that they do not cover, so that's how I got started doing this, was just to sort of fill that gap. So every quarter, I take all the arm's length home sales in Philadelphia, and I run a regression analysis that eliminates all the noise and seasonality from the data to basically uncover what the underlying secular movements in house prices are that are driven by the market forces. So think of this as a Dow Jones index for the typical Philadelphia home. The red line represents Philadelphia County. The green line represents the entire metropolitan area of Philadelphia and its surrounding suburbs. And the blue line is the U.S. average. That's the house price index for the average U.S. home published by the federal government. All the indexes have a starting value of 100 in the year 1980. And so the percent change in the index over time reflects the relative appreciation or depreciation rate of the typical Philadelphia home over time. As you can see, looking at the red line over time, you can see, there's the boom of the 80s, there's the decline of the early 90s, and you see the housing bubble years of the mid-2000s. The housing crash from 2007 to 2012. House prices in the city fell approximately 23%. And then you see where we are today. We have recovered almost all the losses from the last recession. We're well into positive territory. And the last 7 or 8 years have probably seen the most house price appreciation driven by market fundamentals we've probably seen in the entire post-World War II era. To give you some numbers on that, if we go to the next slide. So over the course of the past year, this shows the total house price appreciation rates by geographic market in each column. So in the second column is the appreciation rate for just Philadelphia. Over the course of the last year, house prices have risen 3.6% on average in the city. Obviously, that's a citywide average. There's certainly local variation. Historically speaking, the average house price appreciation rate in Philadelphia is about 4 to 5% per year. Okay, 4 to 5% per year is what, on average, you could expect a typical home to do across the city. That's better than a corporate bond or a T-bill, but not quite as good as the stock market. We are at 3.6% from last year, which means right now house prices are still or have been appreciating, but they're doing so at a decelerating rate. They're appreciating at a sub-average, subpar rate than what they have done historically. So still growing, but at a slower pace. We go to the next slide. The red line here is the Philadelphia index. The black line is the Case-Shiller index for the 10 largest U.S. cities. It's a composite index. You can see that historically Philadelphia tends to lag most other large U.S. metro areas. The red line you see is below the black line for most of the time. But you notice that we don't boom as much during the boom times. We don't fall as hard during the bad times. We also tend to be a bit of a lagging indicator as well. You see most other markets tend to peak before we do, and they tend to hit bottom before we do. So in one sense, that's to our advantage because if you want a leading indicator for the Philadelphia housing market, if you look at the indicators for house prices or home sales in other cities, we tend to lag the largest U.S. metro areas by about 3 to 6 months. So if that's what you'd like to do to follow the market, then now you know. Next slide. Now there's a lot of content in this deck. Some stats are more pertinent than others, so I'm going to skip over some of them or go through some of them really fast. This is the same slide as the previous one, and instead of showing the level of the house price index, it shows the percent change over time. You can see the big dip, big spike in the middle is the housing bubble, the big dip right after that's the housing burst. Again, notice that we did not fall as much as those other metro areas during the bubble burst. And right now, year-on-year appreciation in Philadelphia is not as high as it was 2 to 3 years ago. It's still in positive territory, but you can see, again, it is growing at a decelerating rate. So that's the red line. We're above 0. So again, house prices are growing, but we're getting close to 0, which means they are decelerating. Next slide. This breaks it down by submarket. So I divide the city into basically like 9 neighborhoods, and you can compare the indices for the different neighborhoods. At the very bottom, the yellow line, the lowest appreciating neighborhood, lower Northeast Philly. At the very top of the peak, the brown line is South Philadelphia, which you can see over the last 7 or 8 years has gone through a real renaissance. So you can view this on your own time, depending on which area of the city you're interested in. Next slide. This again breaks out the house price appreciation rate by submarkets. Again, for most of the different submarkets, you can see we are still in net positive territory on the year. You can see we're in the 3 to 4% range. So, and even across the city, some areas are above average. Like, believe it or not, North Philadelphia had the highest appreciation rate over the course of the past year. It's not because I think North Philadelphia necessarily is growing. It's because of the revitalization or gentrification or whatever you want to call it that's creeping north from Center City that's raising the average house price there. But again, you can review these on your own time since we're time limited today. Next slide. This is just how geographically how I define the submarkets. Next slide. This compares the median house price in Philadelphia to my house price index. One of the reasons I like to show this is that it gives support for why it's worth computing an index rather than just looking at the raw median or average house price over time. The blue line is the median house price in Philly. You notice has a lot more volatility than the red line. That's because of the seasonality that's in house prices. As you know, house prices go up in the warm weather months, they fall in the cold weather months. And moreover, that seasonality has become more pronounced over time. Notice that since the housing bubble burst, the volatility of that blue line has actually increased. I don't know why house prices in Philadelphia have become more seasonal. I don't know if this is a sensitivity to people become more sensitive to climate, or it's a climate change thing, or what. If anyone has any theories on why that is, or any knowledge, I'd be interested in hearing that. But again, you can see the red line, because it controls for seasonality and idiosyncrasies of which homes that sold, you know, big homes versus small homes, old homes versus new homes. It erases a lot of that volatility and noise from the data. Next slide. Next slide. Like I said, I'm going to skip some of these, and some of these are more not as pertinent right now as others. So that's prices. Now we'll look at home sales. So this shows the number of house sales in Philadelphia in each quarter, going back to 1980. And much like prices, you can see house sales are very cyclical. So the red line represents the quarterly average. In any given quarter, just under 4,000 homes change hands in Philadelphia. You can see the peak of the boom of the mid-1980s, then you see the recession of the early 90s, then you see the really big spike of the housing bubble years, the crash after that, and then you see where we are right now. And if you notice, house sales tend to be a bit more of a leading indicator than house prices on the state of the market. And if you look at the shape of the peak all the way to the right, you can see that home sales in the city are still running above average. But again, just like house prices, you can see that they're decelerating. It looks like we hit our peak volume back in 2018. 2019 was a great year. 2020 was a very strong first quarter, primarily because of the warm weather in January and February drove a lot of foot traffic out. This is before, of course, the pandemic and all that. But again, it appears that although we are still running above average, that home sales, just like house prices, appear to be decelerating. Again, providing further support that, you know, we're more or less at the peak of the current cycle. Next slide. This is $1 million homes in Philadelphia. Again, you can see the real surge during this current cycle. Even during the housing bubble years, we've outpaced the number of $1 million home sales in the city, primarily because we've got a lot of wealthy people moving into the city that have been bidding up values. I see we have a comment here that sales lag 2 to 3 months. Yes, as deals are struck early. That's the big caveat to this report. Even I broke out the March numbers from this just to look at March and compared it to last year to see if it was different. And March was actually, on paper, a fairly decent month. But again, because the data reflects, I'm using closing dates as the date of sale, not the date of the sale, the agreement was signed or the price was agreed upon. So really the conditions, the numbers reflected in this report are really reflecting conditions in January and February, less so than March. So that said, the numbers are what they are, the timeliness is what it is. So we're just gonna roll with what we have. So moving forward. This is a map of home sales in the first quarter of 2020. I use warm colors to denote relatively high price sales and cold colors to denote relatively low priced ones. So you can see that in and around Center City, prices of homes went for $230 a square foot or more. And the blue dots, which are the lowest quintile of prices, those are homes that transacted at a price point of $105 per square foot or less. Next slide. Then I break out these maps, just zooming on different parts of the city. Again, you can do this on your own time. So Matt, let's just scroll through these real quick. There's South Philly, Kensington, West and Southwest Philly, North Philly, Northwest Philly, and Northeast Philly. We'll just keep going. This shows the annual house price rate of change by submarket. And let's get through this. I want to get to the inventories part because that's key. These are $1 million home sales in the city. And I've got some other diagnostics here. Let's just keep going. These are not as pertinent right now to where we are in the cycle as some of the other slides I want to show. This entire slide deck, by the way, is available on Drexel's website. I can give out the URL at the and the link at the end of this. Let's just keep going. All right, so here's inventories. There we go. Back one, please. As you all know, inventories are at all-time lows, and they just keep dropping. You can see, historically speaking, there's about 6,000 homes listed for sale in the city in any given month. This data goes back to 2001. Right now, we're deep into a seller's market. You can see that inventories, again, also tend to be a good leading indicator of the market. Notice that inventories peaked in 2006 during the last cycle. before the actual prices actually peaked in 2007, and then the crash came in 2008. You can see inventory has been running below average now for several years, and they really just plunged again this past winter. We're at an all-time low. If you go to the next slide, you can see the month supply of inventory. You can see again, we're deep into a seller's market right now. We've got about 2.5 months supply of homes for sale. And again, I think that's one of the reasons that we've seen some of the house price appreciation that we have, and that concerns me, is because the supply has just been so very low. So house prices have not only been risen just due to improvements in our underlying fundamentals of the market. You know, we've been growing in population, we've been growing in incomes, we've had a pretty decent economy the past few years, but also supply has really been restricted. There's a variety of reasons for that. I'm sure some of you, most of you know what they are. We have investors that have been riding the rising rental boom. They don't want to let go of their properties that they snapped up during the last recession. We've got demographic issues with the millennials not being able to afford to buy. And of course, there's other issues with people. Some people are still in a negative equity position and are locked into their current home and can't afford to move up. And certainly the current conditions are not helping that. Next slide. Days on market is highly seasonal and month to month. So I fit a polynomial spline through it, and you can see days on market is also starting to rise, the amount of time it takes to move a home, which again is a leading indicator that we're basically near the top of the current cycle, if not already passing it. Next slide. Home builder sentiment. So the National Association of Home Builders surveys its members every month and says on a scale of 0 to 100, are you optimistic or pessimistic about your business? Anything over 50 indicates that more builders are optimistic than pessimistic. Anything under 50 indicates they're more pessimistic than optimistic. So you see the drop back in 1991 during that recession, and you see the huge plunge when the housing bubble burst from 2007 to 2008. And if you look all the way to the right, that steep drop, it looks practically vertical, is actually the current change in home builder sentiment from February to March. The home builder sentiment index had a value of 75 as recently as February. The blue line is just for the home builders in the Northeast. Similar value of about 65 for home builders in the Northeast. And from the rollover from February to March when the pandemic hit, the national index plunged to 19 in 1 month. So to say home builders are pessimistic would be an understatement. I'd be more inclined to say they are more or less on suicide watch. Luckily, the governor and the mayor have allowed construction to resume, so they're starting to feel a bit better about that. But if you think you have problems, just imagine all the money these guys owe to their contractors and their vendors and to the lenders, and not being able to complete their building or even get it out of the ground. So as tough as you might think you have it, believe me, those guys are really trying to hang in there. Next slide. This is the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Housing Sector Index. It's a market cap-weighted index. It is composed of about 20 companies, publicly traded companies, whose primary lines of business are in housing. So you've got home builders and suppliers of materials, mortgage insurers, title companies, things like that. You can see the giant plunge. The index had an all-time high back in January of about $375 a share. And you see the huge plunge from January to February. It fell about 47%, but it's actually come back a bit. You can see it's right now at a value of about $250. So again, it's not back to where we would like it to be, but it seems to have recovered somewhat. And again, of course, stock prices tend to be a very good forward-looking indicator. So we don't know what the entire shakeout of this would be, but it seems that the market anyway has capitalized, already appears to have capitalized most of the expected losses into the share prices of companies that are involved in home building. Next slide. Building permits in Philadelphia, you can see have been trending up. This shows the number of residential building permits in terms of the number of units from 1990 to 2020. This past winter was actually saw quite a surge in building permits. It surprised me because now anything that gets a building permit issued after January 1st is no longer qualifying for the 10-year tax abatement. But perhaps something about the good weather or just what had been optimism about the economy, saw actually quite a bit of building permits filed and approved in the city. On an annualized basis, we would not expect as many new units to come on the market this year as we did last year. But again, the year's not over, so we'll see what will happen. Next slide. And then lastly, Zillow produces a forecast for all the major metropolitan areas in the country, down to the county level. This is their forecast for Philadelphia. So I just take my house price index and append their one-year forecast to it. That's the dashed line. For the past several years, Zillow, like the prices have been shown, Zillow had been forecasting positive price appreciation in the city, but at a decelerating rate. This past month, they changed their forecast for Philadelphia to negative for the first time in several years. They are currently projecting house prices in the city will decline 1.1% over the next 12 months. Now, their actual forecast, if you break it out by month, is sort of U-shaped. So 1.1% is the average over the next 12 months. So you could see, a drop of 7-8% over the next 6 months, followed by improvements of 9 to 10% after that. So it averages out to 1.1%. I actually think this forecast is a little optimistic. But again, major housing analytics firm also seems to confirm what these own numbers are showing us, which is the increasing pessimism for the state of the market. So with that, the next slide is the end. So that's the state of the market. So then that's the good news. Now I've got the bad news, the impact of the pandemic. But before I jump into that, do we want to take any questions, Matt?
Sure. Hold on for 1 second. So folks, if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat now. That would be a great time to do that while we tee up the next slide presentation.
Again, remember, all the data you saw in that is based upon homes that had a closing date between January and March. So like I said, it's a bit of a lagging indicator.
All right, Kevin, seeing no questions, we'll go right into the next deck. And if questions pop up, folks, just drop them on in.
Maybe people are in shock. All right, so this one is also rather, did I construct this with a team? Yes, a group of us at Drexel did it. I'll take some further questions at the end. Let's do this. This slide deck is rather lengthy, so again, I'm gonna jump through it fairly quickly and try to stick to the main points. So first of all, why did we do this? Well, as an economist, ever since this pandemic broke, I started getting peppered with questions about what the economic shakeout of all this will be. So I figured, well, why not take a run at trying to answer it? So a group of us at the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation huddled up a few weeks ago, and we thought, well, how do we look at this? Is there, typically what you do with something like this is you examine the research literature to examine what the economic impact was of previous events like this that happened before. And as it turns out, there is an excellent comparable for the current pandemic, and that's the Spanish flu pandemic that whacked Philadelphia really hard 100 years ago. So if we'll go to the next slide. Again, I'm going to go through these quite quickly. So we're going to try to estimate what could and will be the likely impact on both our economy and our real estate market. Next slide. And how important our particular response to it will determine the actual outcome. Next slide. So like I said, I had several motivations. Next slide, or I should say next bullet points. As this wears on, it's obviously be an adverse effect on both the local and national economy. Next. But how big, broad, and long will it be? Next. Moreover, there is a trade-off between the economic harm caused by the pandemic and also the economic harm caused by the continued quarantine and shutdown. But what exactly is it? How can we measure what that trade-off is? So that was something else that as we started doing this, we figured we would try to answer. Just keep going here. Next. So we're going to use the last major global pandemic, the Spanish influenza of 1918 to 1920, as the case study. And we're going to look at what the research said about that pandemic's impact on the human and economic toll on both Philadelphia and the national economy was, and then try to extrapolate that forward using the current projections of mortality rates from the current pandemic and see what can shake out. So next. 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 All right. Just keep going through this. We'll give a brief history. Present the main findings and apply them to Philadelphia, conclude with a summary discussion. Next. All right, so why focus on Philly? Well, we're a large U.S. city and we serve as a comp for most other large U.S. cities since the virus's impact has been most pervasive in dense urban areas. Among large U.S. cities, Philadelphia suffered disproportionately from the last global pandemic 100 years ago and thus serves as a good case study. And of course, next, I live and work here, so I care about it. Next. All right, so first we'll do a quick little history lesson here. Starting with some history. Until the current COVID-19 pandemic, believe it or not, the 1918 influenza was actually the most recent and most severe global pandemic in modern history. Next. And like the current one, it was caused by an H1N1 virus that also had avian origins. Next. And it spread at a very, very fast rate. Next. The first cases actually occurred in the spring of 1918, but it didn't become a global pandemic until the fall of that year. It took about 6 months before it really took off. These are some actual pictures of the time. And it didn't officially end until December of 2020. So it only had about a complete span of about 2 years. Next. By the time it was over, it took the lives of 50 million people worldwide. Next. And 675,000 of them were in America. Right? 675,000 was the last death toll nationally. How badly did Philly get hit? Next. Very, very badly. Next. Just over 12,000 Philadelphians were estimated to have died of the virus. Now, to compare that today, to give you some context, we have about, I believe we're up to about, was it 180, 185? I believe is the current fatality toll from the current virus here in Philadelphia. 12,000 people during the last one. And by the way, we were a smaller city then too. So even as a percent of our population, the loss was higher. Next, here's a picture of actually men digging a mass grave for flu victims in South Philadelphia. Next. This chart shows the mortality rate and deaths per 100,000 people of the last Spanish influenza across U.S. cities. We ranked second. Go ahead, hit next. We were second only to Pittsburgh in terms of the total mortality rate. I'm guessing the higher mortality or fatality rate in Pittsburgh had something to do with the air quality at the time, given the industry there and the steel industry. Next. So why did we get hit so hard? Next. Because we made one very big mistake. Next. In late September 1918, it was just a few weeks after the first recorded cases of the virus being in the city decided to throw a parade on South Broad Street to raise money for Liberty bonds for World War I. And it was, like I said, the purpose was to boost patriotic support and public financing for the war. Next. They expected about 10,000 people to show, but instead, next, 200,000 people showed up. That's South Broad Street there, looking north. You can see the Statue of Liberty in front of City Hall. And if you look to the left, you can see what is the Ritz-Carlton today. Next. And as you can see, they did not know the word or phrase social distancing yet. Next. After that day, things escalated very, very, very fast. Just 5 days after the parade, Philadelphia experienced hundreds of new cases. Dozens of deaths were being reported each day. As one guy wrote in a book about the great influenza, within 72 hours after the parade, every single bed in each of the city's 31 hospitals was filled, and people began dying. Hospitals began refusing to accept patients. Next. And those numbers would quickly grow to literally be off the charts. Next. This is a slide from 100 years ago showing Philadelphia influenza deaths by years. You can see they began tracking it in 1890, but then by 1920, they literally did not have enough room left on the chart and had to go off of it. Next. So people began taking their own personal precautions. Next. This might look a little familiar to you. Next. City officials reacted by ordering all schools, theaters, and churches closed indefinitely. Next. This was followed by mandatory closure of bars, pool rooms, dance halls, places like that. Hotels, barbershops, restaurants, and lunch counters were left open, but the employees were required to cease work upon the first sign of the flu. Next. And public health campaigns were also initiated by the city. Apparently, Philadelphians of 100 years ago were really, really, really into spitting. There were all these signs over the place that said spit spreads death. You can see it on what was then a SEPTA trolley. There's a lamppost on Broad Street looking to see City Hall's tower in the background. You can see a sign that was at the Navy Yard for the workers saying that spitting spreads Spanish influenza, don't spit. And then there's another poster there from the publication section of the city's emergency board encouraging people to stop spitting. I don't know what was going on 100 years ago. Say what you want about Philadelphians. We may not be known for our most refined manners, but at least we don't see everyone walking around spitting all the time, which apparently happened a lot 100 years ago. I don't know why. Next. Eventually, all public gatherings began to be prohibited, and there was such a severe shortage of medical personnel. The U.S. Surgeon General called in the Red Cross to assist Philadelphia. Next, you'll see a picture here. Next. Even back then, medical and scientific experts knew the importance of flattening the curve. This is actually a chart that was made close to 100 years ago comparing the death rate per 100,000 people in Philadelphia versus St. Louis. Next, St. Louis actually enacted much quicker prohibitions on public gatherings, and they didn't have that massive parade like we did. So you can see they were much more successful in flattening their curve. Here's Philadelphia's death rate over time compared to other U.S. cities. We're highlighted with the red circle there. Again, you can see we got hit much harder than most other U.S. cities. Next. At the virus's peak, 759 people in the city died on a single day. Next. At one point, 2,000 city transportation workers called in sick. Next. And so many phone company employees fell ill, the phone calls became restricted to emergency calls only. And next, when the city's morgue reached its capacity, a local brewery in Brewery Town offered its cooler to store 500 bodies. Then, 2 months after the pandemic began, the economic consequences began to be felt. Next. Starting in November of 1918, the Dow fell 47%. Next. It's only slightly less than how much it fell during our last recession. Here's a chart showing it. Here's the post-pandemic decline beginning in 1918, down 47% from 1918 to 1921. Next. Wholesale prices nationwide fell 37%. Next. Automobile production dropped by 60%. Overall industrial production declined by 30%. Next. Business failures soared by 300%. Next. And those businesses that even survived still suffered an average decline in profits of 75%. Next. Bank failures increased from 63 in 1919 to 506 by 1921. Next. By June of 1921, the national money supply dropped 9%. Next. Next. National unemployment rose from 1.4% in 1919 to 11.7% by 1921. It's about as high as it was during our last Great Recession. Next. Just keep going. This unemployment rate is close to what it was during our last recession. It's a picture of men at the time looking for jobs. Next. It's also estimated to have been even higher in the densely populated cities where the virus was most prevalent, like in Philadelphia, New York. Unemployment was as high as 20 to 23%. Next. That actually is a picture of people trying to get their deposits from the bank. Next. The downturn did not end until July of 1921. Next. So to summarize, we had an unexpected and previously unknown avian flu strike a major U.S. city and spread extremely quickly. Next. We had infections and mortalities grew at an exponential rate, and medical professionals realized the importance of flattening the curve. In response, the government forced non-essential businesses to close and encouraged people to avoid gatherings, and people began responding by wearing masks in public. Next. After the pandemic began, the stock market plunged and the severe economic downturn subsequently occurred. Next. So, is any of this sounding or feeling familiar to you? A little bit? But fortunately, there's been a number of studies of the actual impact, economic impact, of the last economic contraction post-pandemic that can hopefully give us some guidance on what we can expect. So next, this is as well as obviously what we can do. So what can the research on the last pandemic tell us? Next. All right, so this table summarizes the existing academic literature on the economic consequences of the 1918 flu pandemic. It is a comprehensive survey. That is, there are no research papers that appeared in peer-reviewed journals that I left out of this survey. So you can see each row gives the citation of the study, and then the second column gives the key main finding of each one. So for example, the first one, J.R. Vernon published an article on the 1921 deflation, the role of aggregate supply in the Journal of Economic Inquiry, and he found that following the pandemic, U.S. GDP declined 3.5%. The next one found that as a result of the flu, there was an 18% decline in state manufacturing output, so on and so forth. Again, you can review these on your own. Basically, what I do is I take these findings and I apply them to the current numbers, economic parameters, and expected fatality rates today, and then extrapolate forward to see what could happen. So next. So I took these aggregate economic impacts and I converted them to impacts per thousand deaths from the flu by dividing the total number of deaths at that time into the total population in 1920. Next. I then applied these results to the range of predicted casualties from the current pandemic, then it derives some results. So next. Again, this is online. We can give the link at the end if you'd like to scroll through this at your own pace. So at the time we began writing this report a few weeks ago, we on the website 538, which some of you might know, they published a survey of medical experts and asked them what they expected fatality rates from the current pandemic they thought would be. And each expert didn't just give a number, they gave a range of numbers. So the maximum number they gave is what the expected fatalities would be if we did nothing to prevent its spread. No lockdowns, no work stoppages, no wearing masks, just nothing. And then they gave their best estimate if we followed every possible procedure we could. And then they gave their median estimate, which is something in the middle of what they think will happen given the responses that we've given. So the minimum estimate of number of deaths from the pandemic was 2,000, which, as we know, we've already passed. We're up to about 56, 57,000. And the maximum projection was 2.2 million. But that is if we did absolutely nothing to prevent its spread and gave no special treatment to those with the flu. So we took the median of that range, which is on the next slide. The median number of deaths from all the experts surveyed, given our reactions, is 200,000. Okay, so we're up to about 57,000 deaths. Before all this is done, then again, this survey is about 3 to 4 weeks ago. They expect the total number of fatalities to be 200,000. Okay, so that's the number we're going to go with. We're going to assume 200,000 deaths from all this, and then apply the impacts of those deaths per thousand that the research showed to Philadelphia's economic parameters and inputs, and then see what the outcomes will be. So let's scroll through these next few slides fairly quickly, Matt. Let's just go on the actual analysis. Go. All right, so on to the empirical results. Next. So let's look at total GDP per capita. Next. So Vernon's study, the first one that I showed you, found that for every 1,000 deaths from the 1918 virus, it was a 0.005% drop in GDP. Right? For every 1,000 deaths, GDP dropped by 0.05%. So we take Philadelphia's annual GDP, which is approximately 121 billion. We have a GDP per capita of $76,000, and we apply that $200,000 death rate to the country, and then apply that to Philadelphia. We get this next chart. So this shows the dollar decline in Philadelphia GDP per capita as a function of the number of national COVID-19 deaths. So if you hit next, and then hold here. So if we look at $200,000 deaths, if that's what the total national fatality rate will be, that's projected to reduce Philadelphia's total economic output by about 1.25 billion, and that's about $789 per person. All right, so that's the economic hit we would take just on GDP is $789 per person, based upon, again, 200,000 national deaths and that 0.005% drop in GDP for every 1,000 deaths. Next. So I'm going to, again, move through these fairly quickly because I want to get to the summary at the end and then what the implications are. So then I look at total manufacturing output and output per capita in the city. So Matt, we're just going to keep hitting down here, okay, to get to the bottom line result. Again, applying the effects on manufacturing from the last one. Keep going. 200,000 deaths is projected to reduce Philadelphia's GDP by 300 manufacturing GDP by just over 300 million. And that's a cost of about $14,000 per person employed in manufacturing. So if you work in the manufacturing sector, that's the number that's projected to hit you, and what your annual wages will be. It will be a $14,000 loss. Next. Philadelphia businesses. Again, keep going. So businesses declined 40 to 70% during the last downturn. Keep going. And we again apply those numbers. We've got about 21,000 registered businesses. We're just looking at businesses with employees in this part. So we're not including sole proprietorships or family businesses. So just looking at businesses with employees, we've got about 21,000 such businesses in the city with a total annual payroll of about 32 billion. Next. Applying the fact that every percentage point drop in business revenue is associated with 680 business failures nationwide, and Philly has 3.5% of U.S. businesses. This shows the increase in Philadelphia business failures as a function of the number of national deaths. Next. 200,000 deaths is projected to cause 389 Philadelphia businesses with employees to fail. Now, that may not seem like a big number, but remember, we're only looking at medium to large businesses here. So, if that could be a Comcast or a Preet, just one of those guys going under would have quite an economic impact. Next. Then we look at the impact on revenues. Keep going here, Matt. Keep going. This is the effect on business revenues. We're projecting a decline of 4.4 million in business tax revenues to the city as a result of those business failures. Next. Then if we're looking at the impact on employees of these business failures, this is the increase in Philadelphia business unemployment. 200,000 deaths is projected to translate into an increase in of unemployment of just over 11,000 persons who are employed by businesses. Next. Looking at our poverty level, the pandemic increased the poverty rate last time around. We've got a poverty rate of about 26%. It's expected to rise to about just over 28%. That's an increase of 40,411 persons in poverty in the city of Philadelphia. Next. Now we'll look at capital income, which is basically defined as the total amount of dividends, interest, and rent received by Philadelphians. Given the plunge in the stock market, anything more than 70,000 nationwide deaths is projected to drive annual capital income in Philadelphia, which is about $7,000 per person, to zero. Next. Philadelphia's wages. Keep going. This shows the loss in wages per employee. If we get 200,000 deaths, we're expected to suffer a loss in annual wages of $28,000 per person. And that's a loss in wage tax revenue to the city of $761 million. To put that in context, average household income in the city is about $42,000. So if you take most households take a hit of $28,000 per year to their annual wages, that's quite a hit. Next. The housing market. Now, this was the most challenging one because of all the studies that looked at the economic impact of the last pandemic, none of them looked at housing. So there's no publicly available housing data from that era that would allow me to track what the changes in house prices or home sales were as a result of the pandemic. So we've had to be a bit more creative here. So Matt, keep going. So what we're going to do is we can't look at the direct changes in house prices from the pandemic, but we can look at the factors that drive house prices and how those factors changed in the last pandemic and over time, and then try to extrapolate that forward to current Philadelphia house prices. So of course, as you know, the two main fundamental drivers of house prices on the demand side are population and income. Go to the next slide. Keep going. I'm going to skip over this part. So I'm not looking at taxes or regulations or inventories. They're just not as germane right now to how, the pandemic's not really going to affect that stuff. All right. So we're going to look at the effect of population declines and income declines due to virus-related fatalities in the recession, and then try to extrapolate those forward to see how they will affect house prices. So going to the next slide. All right, I collected data on the changes in house prices and the changes in population and income for 20 large US cities. Here's a scatter plot, and I collected this data from 1990 to 2018. So the horizontal axis shows the total percent change in population for these 20 US cities from 1990 to 2018. And the vertical axis shows the percent change in house prices in those same 20 US cities. And as you can see, there's a positive correlation here. The dashed line is I fit an exponential curve through the data. So if you hit next, I get to my bullet point. So you see there is a positive correlation between population growth and house price growth in metropolitan areas, in cities. Next. And the R squared of this regression is about 59%, which means that changes in population explain about 59% of the changes in house prices over time in urban markets. Next. And we'll keep going here. We'll do the same thing for income. So this shows the percent change in median household income from 1990 to 2018 in those same 20 US cities. And then again, the percent change in house prices on the vertical axis. Again, you can see that house price growth is strongly correlated with income growth. Again, we've got an R squared of 42%, which basically states that income growth explains about 42% of the variation in house price growth across US cities. Bottom line, you have a city that's growing in population and a city that's growing in income, you'll have a city that's growing in house prices, right? Next. Also note in both cases that Philadelphia lies very, very close to the regression line. Next. And that has positive implications, keep going, Matt, for our analysis, because it means the mathematical relationship between income growth, population growth, and house price growth is especially strong for Philadelphia. Next. Unlike, say, Denver or Cleveland, which is located relatively far from the fitted line. Next. So then I ran a regression of the change in house prices simultaneously on the changes in both income and population growth, and I got this. So next, this is not a statistics class, so I don't want to bore you with the details, but bottom line, I've got an R squared of 68%, which is quite high. And moreover, next, keep going. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, highlighted in yellow, you'll see I have pop growth and income growth. Pop growth has a coefficient of 1.67. Income growth has a coefficient of 0.48. Literally what that means is that for every 1% increase in population growth, we typically see a 1.68% increase in house prices. And for every 1% increase in income growth in a city, we see house prices rise by about 0.48%. All right, so I'm going to apply those mathematical relationships to Philadelphia based upon how much I think population and income will decline as a result of the pandemic. Next. Keep going. I'm going to go quickly through here. Converse of that is also true. Decreases in population and income will result in a decrease in house prices. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. So I take the range of population declines, deaths due to the virus, based upon that survey of medical experts. Keep going. Keep hitting down here, man. People can look at this at their own time. Basically what I'm doing here is just stress testing the numbers and showing how I derived them. I want to get to the results. All right, keep going. I create a baseline scenario, a pessimistic scenario, and an optimistic scenario based upon the total number of deaths. Next. Keep going. Keep going. All right. All right, here we go. So this shows the projected total decline in Philadelphia house values in terms of millions of dollars based upon the number of deaths that Philadelphia suffers, okay? If we have 200,000 national deaths, and based upon Philadelphia's share of the national population, that's expected to translate into 962 virus-related deaths in the city. That's projected to result in a total drop in the value of the city's housing stock of about 71%. It's about 82 billion, okay? And the city is expected to subsequently suffer a loss in real estate tax revenue of just over 1 billion. Now, that's a big, big number, okay? First of all, it's based upon us actually hitting those 200,000 deaths. Moreover, it's based upon the massive income effect of the loss in decline in capital income, the loss in rents, dividends and interest, and the decline in wages from the previous charts that I showed you. Again, you know, if in a city with a median household income of 42,000, if they take a hit to their annual wages of $28,000, that's a massive drop in income. And if you apply that, how the percent change in income translates to the percent change in house prices, you get a very, very large drop in house prices, 71%. Next. Okay, keep going. Keep going through here. So that's a loss in the typical Philadelphia home of about $118,000 in the city where the median price is about $165,000. Keep going through here. Then I do it for the optimistic and pessimistic scenario. Now let me give a few comments on that. First of all, why is the expected drop in house prices so big? And first of all, let me say I think it's unrealistically large. The reason is because the research indicates from the past epidemic that the percent decline in incomes that's caused by the recession is projected to be far larger than the percent decline in population, which is caused by the pandemic-related deaths. In other words, the income effect of the pandemic, that is the recession that will result, is going to be far more important for what will happen to house prices than the actual death rate from the pandemic. And I'm fairly confident in that result. Okay, I'm fairly confident. So even though the empirical results indicate that the impact on house prices of just a 1% decline in population is large, because the recession is expected to be so big, again, based upon the past pandemic recession, that's where the real impact on house prices is going to come. So if, in other words, bottom line, if you're worried about what the impact will be on house prices, you should be far more worried about the recession that's going to follow the pandemic than the actual death rate of the pandemic itself. Next. All right, again, even in the worst case scenario, the pessimistic scenario where we experience 35,000 virus-related deaths, keep in mind that's 2.2% of the city's population. Now, 35,000 virus-related deaths would be a terrible thing, but you know, again, a decline in your citywide population of 2.2%, especially when it's mostly among the elderly or the infirm, it's just really not enough to move the needle on house prices. So insofar as the hit on house prices is going to come, the numbers and the research indicate it's not going to come from the death rate or fatality rate. It's going to come from the recession that follows. Okay. Keep going. All right. So then I stress test these things. Like I said, creating the different scenarios. Let's just go through this very quickly because the stress testing basically confirms that whatever happens is going to be bad. And what's going to matter more is the recession that follows rather than the actual fatality rate from the pandemic itself. So Matt, just keep going here. Just basically showing my methodology here. All right, so here's the total expected economic cost of Philadelphia by scenario. Next. Okay, so this shows for each of the different scenarios, pessimistic, baseline, and optimistic. The first row is the number of deaths in Philadelphia we can expect. Then what the decline in Philadelphia GDP will be. Then the decline in manufacturing, number of business failures, increase in the unemployed persons, increase in persons in poverty, loss in capital income, total loss in wages and billions, and the total loss in house value. So as you can see, the total cost of this thing, again, if we hit at least 200,000 national deaths, will be quite high. It will be in the billions. I will know it's not all going to happen all at once. It will be over the course of several years, but it will be large. Next. Keep going. So there's three things that you can take away from the table. First of all, like I said, the costs are projected to be very large in the billions. Anything beyond the optimistic scenario, they become catastrophically large in the tens and even hundreds of billions. Moreover, as the number of deaths increase, the economic costs increase at an exponential, that is an increasing rate. So the relationship's not linear, it's non-linear. You can take, you know, a relatively low level of deaths with almost minimal effect, but as that death rate grows, even if the death rate grows linearly, the economic costs grow exponentially. Next. And next, keep going. So then what I'm going to do is I want to estimate what the cost-benefit trade-offs are of the virus of the economic costs are basically the costs of the continued work shutdown and self-quarantining, and of course the benefits of the number of lives that that saves. So keep going. So again, based upon the range of the different scenarios, I came up with a cost-benefit chart. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. All right. Keep going, keep going, keep going. I'm just showing here I computed this stuff. Keep going. All right. So the total go back. Go back. All right. So the pandemic's total cost to Philadelphia based upon the range of fatalities is expected to range between 31 billion and 411 billion. That works out to about $51,000 to $690,000 for each household in the city. Then, of course, implies that the city will have to about heavily to bear this cost since our median household income is $46,000. So the cost of the pandemic, is $51,000 per household, and median household income is $46,000. That's pretty much going to wipe you out. So if we go to the next slide, what I have next is I look at the cost per. If you look at the chart, these are no longer the total economic impact. Now I'm comparing the costs and benefits of self-quarantining versus lives that are saved. So if you look at the total, I take the total cost of Philadelphia in billions, divide that by the number of potential Philadelphia deaths minus the number of Philadelphia deaths prevented, which is the number of lives saved. And if you look at the second to bottom line, you can see the total dollar costs per Philadelphia household per death prevented as a result of the quarantining and work shutdown. So it works out to, in the baseline scenario, of about 47, the cost, let me phrase that. Dividing these costs by the number of deaths prevented will give you the dollar cost to the city of each life that's saved, all right? Now that ranges from a low of about 7 million to a high of about 39 million. Now it's not the total cost of saving these lives, it's the total cost per life that's saved, okay? A minimum of about $7 million per life. Now, like I said, it would be, I don't want to put an explicit dollar value on human life, but again, it does seem reasonable to point out that most people do not earn millions of dollars over the entire course of their life, much less over a few years. And if that's the cost of saving it, you can see that it is quite expensive and that the city would have to borrow quite heavily to bear this cost since we won't be able to tax our way out of paying this bill. So we go to the next slide. So lastly, I create this cost benefit chart, which shows the cost to each Philadelphia household on the horizontal axis of the pandemic for the different scenarios. And then on the vertical axis are the benefits, which is the number of deaths that are prevented. So you see at the very low level, as a result of the total recession that the shutdown and some quarantining is expected to impose, you get a cost to each Philadelphia household of about, I said, $30,000, but we'll save several thousand lives as a benefit of that. But that cost starts to grow very, very quickly as the number of deaths start to grow. So, right now we're at about 55,000 deaths nationally. If we end up hitting 200,000, then the cost per household is expected to be very high, especially as the shutdown and self-quarantining continues, because basically if no one's working, then the economy's not growing. If the economy's not growing, well, then we're not producing anything that we can sell to pay for the cost of this. And next. So keep going. So costs grow exponentially more. We got a very high R squared value, which supports the solidity of these results. Keep going. Summary discussion. So those are some pretty big numbers and they're very serious. But I want to emphasize that that's not predicting what will happen, but rather what could happen. More specifically, and this is very important, all those outcomes that I just showed you are heavily contingent upon two very big things. One, we have a very large US death toll. We have to have at least 200,000 US deaths. Right now we've hit 57,000 and it appears to have leveled off. So that's good. That's good. Moreover, it also assumes that the current US economy will react to this death toll in a similar manner as it did 100 years ago. So let's put that in context and discuss that, because I think there's some room for optimism there. Next slide. All right, let's examine the likelihood of both contingencies occurring. Like I said, as of this writing, there's been about, this is a few weeks ago, basically what I'm showing here is the number of deaths in the US appears to have peaked and is currently leveling off. Keep going here. That's deaths per day in Philadelphia. Again, they appear to have peaked about 2 weeks ago. Next. Matt, can you hear me? Someone just wrote that we've lost audio.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, so we're good? All right.
Yep.
Moreover, don't forget that the death toll from the last pandemic was much higher than the current one in both absolute and relative terms. So even if we hit 200,000 deaths during this pandemic, during the last one 100 years ago, it was 675,000 deaths. So more than 3 times what they're predicting from this one. And moreover, the US population 100 years ago was smaller than it was today. So they had more than 3 times the actual number of deaths, but even the percent impact of those deaths was much higher than what they're currently predicting today. So, to get such catastrophic results, we would have to hit that level of death rate as we did during the last pandemic, which we're currently not predicting. Next one. Keep going through here. So like I said, our population was smaller then. So even the population that lost percentage is going to be smaller this time around. Moreover, economists actually disagree on to what extent the last post-pandemic contraction was actually caused by the 1918, 1920 pandemic. So here's some actual quotes from the peer-reviewed research from those papers that I showed you. It was not just the last pandemic that caused that recession. There were a number of other factors as well. You had troops returning from the war, which created a surge in the civilian labor force, which pushed down the wage rate and increased the unemployment rate. There was a decline in agricultural commodity prices because now that Europe had recovered from the war, they could start producing their own food again. During the war, we were selling them their food. There was a tighter monetary policy to combat the post-war inflation in 1919. Of course, higher interest rates are typically associated with a slowing economy. And there was also expectations of future deflation that led to reduced investment, which also led to a shrinking GDP. So it wasn't just the last pandemic that caused the post-pandemic recession of 100 years ago. There was some other factors that caused it as well. Next. Also, government policy was a key factor. Federal spending was cut, the budget was pushed down, and the New York Fed raised its discount rate to 7% by June of 1920. So you can imagine a discount rate of 7% today in our current interest rate environment. So, of all the economic shakeouts that will happen from this pandemic, the one thing that no one's really predicting is some huge spike in interest rates, at least as led by the Federal Reserve. Next. And also, even though most economists may disagree on how much the Spanish flu was to blame for the downturn that followed it, they generally do agree that the actual 1920 to 21 downturn was sharp, but it was actually quite short. Next. And the recovery that followed was quite robust. Next. So here's some quotes from some other experts, including some of the authors from the research that I showed you. Next. So again, the panic of 1920 started out as a contender for the greatest depression of all time, but the economy corrected itself within 2 years. It was a short depression that lasted from 1920 to 21. Depression of 1920 was a brief economic depression. It was notable for its quick turnaround, and the pain was acute, but the pain was brief. Next. Most of the economic evidence indicates that the economic effects were short-term, the economy rebounded quickly, et cetera, et cetera. Next. And actually, one author found there was actually a positive effect from the pandemic because by decreasing the population, it actually ended up in an increase in wages because there were fewer workers, so they could negotiate higher wages. Next. Keep going. And they claim that's one of the reasons the Roaring '20s were actually so roaring. So you see the depression of 1920 to 21 there on the left, and then you see the Dow rising 500% once that recession ended. Next. And as a result, that depression is actually called the Forgotten Depression. And a guy even wrote a book about it. And I'd like to hope we could be so lucky with this one. Next. All right, so what are the key takeaways? So first of all, the empirical results indicate that the cost of a post-pandemic recession could indeed be very large. All right, total potential cost of Philadelphia between $31 billion and $411 billion. That comes in the form of lost income, lost housing wealth, lost tax revenue, and reduced public services. For the typical Philadelphia household, that works out to a range of at least $52,000 to as much as $692,000 over the course of both the pandemic and the subsequent recession. Next. The actual benefit that's the counterpart to this is numerically large, but also quite expensive. So the number of deaths that the shutdown is expected to prevent is expected to range between 4,000 and 11,000, but that's going to come to at a cost of about $7 million to as high as $39 million for each of those deaths that are prevented. And more importantly, most of those people are elderly or infirm and more likely to be prone to die from the virus, and thus they're not working. So it implies that we will have to borrow heavily to bear this cost since we can't tax our way out of paying that bill. Next. But like I said, those are big numbers, but they're heavily contingent upon 2 very large assumptions. One, the number of deaths in the US will at least be as high as 200,000. And then moreover, the post-pandemic downturn will be as severe as the previous one of 1920 to 21. Like I said, as of the time of this writing, at least one of these assumptions would seem to be rather overstated. Next. But one factor that is very different about the current pandemic versus the last one is the current massive work stoppage and self-quarantining. Although during the last pandemic of 100 years ago, Philadelphia forced many businesses that were places of large social gatherings to close, I could find no evidence of anything resembling the scale of the current shutdown. That would seem to make intuitive sense because most jobs 100 years ago couldn't be done from home. There was no internet, no computers, limited phone access, so most people had to go to work. It was just an economic fact. So most people still reported for work during the last pandemic, even if they did so with some trepidation and caution. Next. Also, the duration or the length of the last pandemic can help inform us about the expected duration of the current one, and that can give some implications for how long to maintain the current quarantine and work stoppage. So here's a chart from the last pandemic showing total cumulative deaths over time by U.S. city. You can see the top line there is Philadelphia. And again, hit next, Matt. Keep going. Look at the bottom horizontal axis. That has the weeks prior to and following the week of greatest mortality. It has a range of -3 to +3, which implies that the total duration of the last pandemic, at least in terms of where the period when the deaths were concentrated, was only 6 weeks. It was only 6 weeks, okay? Now we're basically on to week 6 of the current shutdown, all right? And we've also seen a peaking, it appears to be a peak, in the current fatality rate. So even though that last pandemic, which took 12,000 Philadelphia lives, and remember, housing conditions back then are not what they are today, health conditions are not what they are today, certainly medical technology 100 years ago is not what it was today, the pandemic basically burned itself out in 6 weeks, even given the fact they didn't have the quarantining measures we do today or the medical technology we do today. The vast majority of those 12,000 deaths were crammed into a period of 6 weeks, which we're basically hitting right now, okay? Next. Historical commentary from that time also supports the assertion that the primary duration of the pandemic was about 6 weeks. Here's a quote from the from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Although the pandemic began on September 28th, by October 9th, there was an article in the Inquirer had the headline "Signs of Epidemic Wearing Itself Out." And another line, by mid-November, the epidemic had mostly subsided in Philadelphia. On November 11th, which most of you may recognize as what today is Veterans Day, it's because that was the end of World War I. Germany became the last of the Central Powers to sign a ceasefire agreement ending the war, and thousands of Philadelphians once again flooded the streets in celebration. Remember, this is only a few weeks after 12,000 Philadelphians died from the pandemic. They all turned out in the streets to celebrate the end of the war, and there was no subsequent surge in a second wave of the pandemic. The pandemic still lasted another year. There were still deaths from it, from the Spanish influenza, but there was no second surge. Keep that in mind. I think that's an important implication. Next. So in summary, results from that pandemic suggest the economic consequences of the current one could indeed be severe, but these results are heavily reliant upon two major assumptions, of which at least one appears to be very questionable. But the numbers also suggest that the economic consequences of the prolonged work stoppage and self-quarantining would also be equally, if not more severe, than the direct consequences of virus-related deaths. And that will be especially true if the duration of quarantine exceeds the duration of the actual pandemic, as suggested by the relatively short duration of the 1918 pandemic score. In other words, the longer the quarantine continues after the true dangers of the pandemic have subsided, that is when the economic costs of it will grow exponentially higher. And those economic costs will be as a result of unnecessary extension of the shutdown rather than of the actual deaths from the actual virus itself. So next, summing up the bottom line, the results suggest that policymakers and elected officials should be conscientious about the magnitude of the potential economic losses due to containing the virus, that is the quarantining, as they address the potential losses due directly to the virus itself, which is deaths. And I hope they use this information to plan an adaptive response tailored to the severity of the crisis. So with that, Matt, next. Thank you.
Okay. So we have lots of questions in the chat. So thank you, Kevin. That was a whole lot in a small amount of time. Let's go into those questions. What do we have there in the chat? I see a 0. Yikes. Yikes are never a good thing, right? So Kevin, how do you want to handle this? You want to go in there yourself and look at the questions? I know you were picking out of there a few times while we were rolling through.
Before they were popping up on my screen. Is there someplace I go to look for them?
Yeah, so you should be able to see down at the bottom tool tray. It says chat. Do you see that?
Oh, here we go. One of the scariest photos was a run on the bank. Can you see that happen again? I am concerned about that, especially as this drags on, because you know, you maybe go a few weeks without income, and maybe go a month. And that's when, of course, all the bills start coming due: your rent or mortgage, your utility bills, tuition bills, things like that. And you know, we are a city with a poverty rate of 25, 26%. We've got a lot of people in the city that can't survive more than a month, not even a few weeks, without having to dip into what meager savings they have. And so, yeah, I actually am a bit concerned about a run of the bank. So, you know, we have a much more sophisticated financial system today, and past experience with dealing with depressions. I actually used to work for the Federal Reserve. That was my first job out of college. And, you know, they stand by to maintain liquidity during a crisis. One of the reasons the Great Depression happened last time around is because the Federal Reserve reacted to the plunge in the stock market by raising interest rates. And one of the reasons that more recent ones have never been as bad is because the Fed is standby to provide liquidity. So I'm hoping we don't see that. But if we do, hopefully our federal government is more prepared today and for such a situation than they were 100 years ago or 80 years ago. Next. So what will happen if the supply of houses continue to be low? Again, you know, what happens, we're in a race now between low supply and low demand. So it's a question of which one's going to win. If supply drops faster than demand, that will provide support to house prices. But if demand plunges, especially if incomes plunge, from all the scary charts that I showed you, then, you know, the fall in demand could outstrip the fall in supply. So even if we only have a 1-month supply in homes, you know, if demand goes to close to zero, then obviously you'll see house prices drop.
So Kevin, if you can scroll up, there's a whole host of other questions. And I'm seeing some stuff about, you know, some things that were different back then from what they are today. And we have one question about, this is based on the events in an economy over 100 years ago. The US economy has changed dramatically in that time, where job and industry types have shifted from manufacturing to service. Also, there's welfare that's involved now that perhaps wasn't there then. So with 1/3 of the population on some form of social welfare and a willingness of the government to print money and policy that can come from both the feds and legislation, how is this different?
Well, again, that's one of the other big contingencies of these results are predicated upon is how our economy will react today versus how it did 100 years ago. Like I pointed out earlier, the work stoppage and self-quarantining that we have today would not have been possible 100 years ago because people just couldn't work from home back then like they do today. They had to go and report to work. And it's one of the reasons the hit to manufacturing was so large the last time around. The hit to manufacturing in Philadelphia is not expected to be as big because manufacturing is a much smaller part of our economy in the city today, much more so than it was 100 years ago when we were the, quote unquote workshop of the world. So, that again, one of the reasons that pandemic hit so hard was because those sectors got hit so hard, and we're not expecting them to get hit as hard today because they're not as large. But that said, we do know that with the service sector being so large, the service sector will take a much bigger hit this time around. And so therefore what the ultimate shakeout will be, I think, is much more so in our control than I think is in the pandemic's control. Because like I said, there is this very real trade-off between extending the work stoppage and the quarantining versus containing the pandemic. And I don't mean to minimize the loss of lives or dangers that come from the pandemic itself, but the longer it goes on, is the cost becomes exponentially higher because as the death rate declines, the economic costs increase from extending the quarantining.
Does your analysis take into effect any actions that have been taking place with the CARES Act and stimulus and all that stuff? Is that in the mix with your analysis?
Are you telling me this analysis wasn't long enough?
I'm just reading questions from our folks.
This was a report, not a dissertation. No, I wanted to keep it focused. So I said, what happened 100 years ago? What could happen today if we hit those same numbers? And how realistic is that? That's basically the two questions I tried to answer. So no, short answer, no, I did not take those other things into account. But in academia, we're always looking for research grants. So if someone out there who asked that would like to fund it, hit me up.
Okay.
Matt, you want to read me some other questions?
Yeah. Do you know what percentage of Philadelphia's workforce can/cannot work from home?
No, actually, I don't.
Okay. No, GPAR will not be paying for an academic study. That was a question in there.
It wasn't a serious question.
No, but someone just posted that in there with a LOL. So
Oh.
I was answering that for them. Does price range have any bearing on the future?
I'm not sure what that question is asking.
Yeah, Jody, could you maybe refine that question for us a little bit?
In the price range of homes?
Someone was giving advice, some financial advice, saying banks failed, better go make a withdrawal.
All right. So will the entire market be affected, or will some prices be affected? Yeah, obviously this is going to hit the lower end of the market much harder than the higher end. I mean, these are people, we've got a lot of people in the city that, can't last more than a few weeks without help. Now, luckily, as someone else pointed out, we do have government programs today and safety nets that we didn't have 100 years ago that will help them out. But yeah, I mean, most definitely, I'm certain we're going to see a rise in, first of all, delinquencies on rents, and then eventually delinquencies on mortgages, and inevitably there'll be some foreclosures, behind that. And I would imagine it's going to be disproportionately homes in, lower income neighborhoods in the city than it will be in Center City or Chestnut Hill.
Michael chimes in that he's going to need a 64-ounce takeout mixed drink. That sounds like a medicinal proactive action right there. Number of businesses.
Oh, Matt, I like to think of whiskey as the hand sanitizer for your insides.
Okay. Number of business failures is based on what number as a starting point? Meaning, how many businesses are we saying there were before the pandemic?
That actual number's on the slide. So the study that looked at business failures from the pandemic 100 years ago only examined failures of businesses that had employees. So it didn't include, there's a lot of sole proprietorships that are part-time businesses that it just doesn't scale. So I only looked at businesses in Philadelphia that had at least 5 employees, okay? The total number is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They actually published that by city, total number of businesses by number of employees. So I just took out, every business that had at least 5 employees and just tallied them up and got the total number of businesses in Philadelphia.
All right, folks, we're going to try to wrap this up quickly. I thought future projections were a V curve. Third quarter is supposed to take off, question mark?
Like I said, I try to conclude on an optimistic note. Remember that last pandemic was much more severe than the current one. The recession that followed was very, very serious, but the recovery was quite robust. It was the roaring 20s. I would love to see a snapback like that. Now, we know how the roaring 20s ended, but that's another story. By the way, if you said you want to wrap this up, we can point people to where they can access this report if you want to pull that up.
Yeah, we'll definitely, we'll send that back out to our members as a follow-up. Have you been in any conversations with Governor Wolf or Mayor Kenny about your report here?
Sadly, they have not sought out my wisdom. Okay. But they know where to find me. Like I said, the report's online. Feel free to circulate it.
Do you have an opinion on the benchmark Wolf set of an average of 55 cases per day for 14 weeks in terms of lockdown extending beyond what's quote unquote necessary?
Yeah, that's a tough call. I mean, I'm an economist, not an epidemiologist. I'm not qualified to say, if we just ended everything, the quarantine today, and just try to let everyone just do whatever they want to, go back to work, go out to eat, whatever. I can't predict how the pandemic would respond to that. What I can predict is what happens if we stay on quarantine as the death rate declines. Because like I said, the more the death rate declines, the more expensive extending the quarantine becomes economically. That's the one thing I am confident in saying.
Okay, so we'll round it out with this last question. If you had to pick a number, what's the percentage by which home prices would fall and how long until recovery?
Well, they fell 23% during the last one, and that was over the course of about 3 years. And that was the Great Recession. Unemployment during the last pandemic hit about the same rate as unemployment during the Great Recession. It was about 11 to 12%. So if we hit that, you could expect something comparable this time, a little over 20% over 3 years.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much for the time you gave to us. Thank you for all the work that your team did to put together that analysis and that study. Thank you to all our members for chiming in and tuning in. This is a big turnout. Almost 200 folks jumped on this Zoom. Obviously, it's not a rosy picture. It's kind of tough to digest. And we're definitely looking for the optimistic version of what Kevin just gave to us. So with that, we'll just have to hope that the right things are happening. We continue to stay safe and that these numbers go in the right direction. Folks, if you could give us your thoughts and impressions before you get out of here, drop them into the chat. We'd love to see you on another one of these in the future. Keep an eye on your inbox. And again, be safe. Kevin, thank you very much. This was a lot of information crammed into a short little session here, and we really appreciate you and your willingness to share it with all of us.
Well, Matt, please bring me back to GPAR when I have some good news to share. That's always a lot more fun to present, okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You always have an open invitation with us. All right, folks, thank you very much. Again, drop your messages in there. Great to see you all. Take care, and we'll see you around soon.
Take care.